All right, I think we can actually get started. As mentioned, I guess, or my plan was to keep this a bit more informal. So at any point in time, feel free to ask questions. But otherwise, I'll just kind of like give you a technical introduction to what you can expect for Arango 3.6. And as always, like your feedback is more than welcome on like what features you're actually missing, what can we deliver as also as a community together, which helps you to leverage ArangoDB better. All right, let me switch over to presentation mode, and let's get started. So the TLDR is basically, if this is the one slide you care about, those are the features. So we have one-chart databases, which are really helping for query performance if you don't have such large data sets. And then the kind of second theme, I would call it, is scalability, observability, and operability. So basically, how can you manage ArangoDB at like larger clusters at larger scales? The next one is Arango search improvements. So you might have heard about Arango search, basically like search features implemented as views on top of ArangoDB. And we have a number of improvements here, which are super helpful to scale also to more queries, and also to give you better support for like fuzzy matching and other cool search features. Furthermore, we got a number of performance improvements. So first of all, probably subquery optimization, whereas previously we recommended, or also the community, just looking through Slack, and now Slack is actually the right term, there were a number of always like recommendations on how to improve queries. And I hope that now with the subquery optimization, actually we allow you to write questions, queries more naturally. Also, we parallelize parts of AQL. So this is actually a staged approach, as it's a pretty big change overall. But I guess this first phase, which we're going to talk about more during this webinar, will already help a lot in terms of query performance, as we can already hit multiple servers in parallel, which was sequential before. And furthermore, for the hot backup feature, which you might have seen in 3.5, we also have a number of improvements here, which help, for example, for again, Arango search and other features. And as probably is going to be the first question for most people, the release time frame, or at least our goal. You know, I guess we are all in tech here. This is always like a goal, but it's actually to release it before end of year, to actually make those features available to you as soon as possible, because especially for one chart, we have a lot of questions already, as this is like a quite big performance improvement, whereas previously you had to fiddle around how to fit your data and charts across different servers. So let's dive in. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jörg. I'm the head of engineering and machine learning at ArangoDB. Previously, I was always switching back and forth between building like large-scale infrastructure with Kubernetes and Apache Mesos, and databases. So my PhD was in distributed database systems, and then I kind of switched back and forth between those two. And now here at ArangoDB, I'm really happy I can kind of combine both those passions in, first of all, scaling out ArangoDB itself, the machine learning efforts, and also being focused on database technology. ArangoDB, as mentioned, there were some people who said they're pretty new to ArangoDB, so maybe just as a quick overview. ArangoDB is a native multi-model database. So what does that mean? So you probably heard about like graph databases, document databases. The experience I had whenever trying to implement something on top was actually it never fits solely into like one single data model. Like if I try to model everything as a graph, I always have to jump through certain hoops. If I try to model everything as a document, I also have to jump through certain hoops. And for example, a typical scenario I also see often in the machine learning world is this combination of having some unstructured data, which I easily want to store in like a document, because like JSON or some other document format really works great for that. I don't have a fixed schema. But on the other hand, I kind of need relationships in between and capture those. So this is kind of the idea of multi-model, of to support different data models in one query engine. I also seen that people try to take different database engines and then they build like this layer on top where they implement and joins and other things they would expect from the database itself to simply combine queries across those database layers. But with a native multi-model database, you actually get that from like one core database engine. So all the performance is staying in like one engine, and also all like the transactional guarantees are served by one engine. ArangoDB is distributed, so even like your graphs can actually spin multiple nodes, keeping the performance in mind here. And it actually comes currently with its own query language. So AQL, Arango query language, is very SQL-like, but actually allows you to query across all those different data models at once. So you don't have to learn like a new language for each of those. And here just kind of like this reminder of like, or this two-layered approach, what I would describe as multi-model. Of course, this was a question I typically get after such webinars is, on the one hand, it's supporting different data models, but on the other hand, it's also supporting the processing of those different data models. So for example, I need to be able to ask graph queries in a natural way. I need to be able to create key value stores in a native way, and also like document or like sub-document queries. In addition, we also got Arango Search, and I just wanted to highlight that here as we have some improvements on that for 3.6. And Arango Search is basically like a full text search engine and natural language processing capabilities across all of those. So just imagine you have like a document with a lot of full text in the text, and then you can leverage Arango Search to actually index and search across that. All right, before we dive into 3.6, let's actually have a quick recall of what we introduced in 3.5. So in 3.5, we introduced hot backups. So basically leveraging and faster consistent snapshots across your entire clusters. We had a number of performance improvements, both across like Arango Search, and probably the other big feature were like smart joins, where I could actually have co-located joins at scale by leveraging like smart co-location of data. And ArangoDB would do that automatically. We also introduced streaming transactions from like various drivers. And otherwise, being also having graph as a data model, we introduced like a number of graph query improvements like k-shortest pass queries. And probably if you care about performance, prune is a pretty important keyword for you to look up. If you're actually interested in more of that, we have a lot of documentation around that. So that's just a short recall of what happened. The other big thing which happened in like the ecosystem is probably ArangoDB Oasis, so our managed cloud service, which currently is in a private beta phase, but will also launch in general availability shortly. And this basically means you don't have to manage your own infrastructure, but can leverage it currently across AWS and Google automatically. And Oasis is taking care of the entire cluster management. ArangoML probably was another open source announcement we had around Strata. So basically, how can you leverage ArangoDB for machine learning, both in terms of on like the core path. So how is this multi-model idea of being able to query natural language to being able to query data and kind of from the same database, which is a super powerful pattern for feature and model engineering. And on the other hand, keeping track of a machine learning infrastructure for like provenance information, for audit information, where also the multi-model idea is super powerful. Again, this is a typical pattern where we have unstructured data, which we want to throw in a JSON document. But on the other hand, we want to be able to query and relate those different document structures, and, for example, be able to figure out which models in production are actually being derived from this one data set here. So this were kind of like the last 3 months over here at ArangoDB. And now to the future. So what are we currently planning for the 3.6 roadmap? As mentioned, the first iteration of 3.6, so 3.60 is probably going to be released this year. So trying to get to being able to ship features faster. Don't quote me on that, but this is our current goal, and it's actually looking pretty good from an engineering side that we can reach that. The big feature is probably this one-chart database. And where does it come from? So currently imagine you, for example, have a graph which would fit on a single node, but you want to keep that across different charts, or similar with your documents. So pretty much, if you think about having a distributed database, there are kind of like two different use cases for that, or two different main drivers to decide I want to distribute my database, because it always comes with like operational and also performance overhead, as most of us know. And the one motivation is simply my data doesn't fit on a single node. And this is the model which ArangoDB already supports pretty nicely, because we can chart your graphs, your collections across different nodes. On the other hand, the other use case for distributing your database is just a fault tolerance and disaster recovery. So actually your data, at least in like one collection, by the way, collection is kind of the ArangoDB speech for table if you come from the relational world. But if your entire collection would fit on a single node, then many people still want a distributed database simply because it gives them fault tolerance. So what happens if one node fails over? I still want my data to be available and consistent, and I want to be able to continue with my operations without any downtime. So those are those two use cases. And with one chart, we actually nicely jump in this middle ground. So if you have a certain part of your data, and this doesn't have to be your entire set of data, but for example, like one collection, which fits on a single node, then you can actually say, I want this to be like one chart. So this will give you a single server behavior, a single node behavior in terms of like asset performance, because ArangoDB then knows it can perform everything locally on that one node, but it's still going to be transferred over to other nodes and replicated, so I still have the same fault tolerance guarantees. So basically what we'll make sure is that all data related to this one chart slash collection is going to end up on a single node. So the query can be provedly be executed on a single node, and hence we get to performance. But and for example, like asset guarantees, you would expect from a single node behavior in ArangoDB, but on the other hand, it will still be replicated to other nodes. So I think this will give you a number of benefits for, first of all, for performance, but also in terms of like asset compliance for transactions, because you can basically expect the single node behavior, but for replicated collections, and still have the same fault tolerance. The other, I would call it theme, because it's not just a single feature, it's actually something we strive to make it easier for you. It's kind of like both scalability, where we have a number of improvements already in, performance improvements, if it comes to like plan distribution, which actually allows or makes running ArangoDB at larger clusters more performant. And on the other side, we're working on what it means to actually operate clusters at scale. So here we are working on the inspector, which is going to be there's actually already like a client-side inspector there, but we actually want to make it server-side, and this is going to make especially collecting debugging information and just get like a cluster state. If something fails, you want to ask the community, hey, this has been wrong. Inspector allows you to kind of gather all those metrics irrespective of your deployment model, and ask like an easy question on the community Slack, or also post a ticket to us. So it basically kind of gives you the collection of your cluster setup and cluster status with like a single command. The other is that we are working towards, it's probably not going to be finished in the first iteration, but in my experience, this also needs like some user feedback. We're actually coming up with a structured metrics API. So kind of, first of all, in conjunction with the exporter, but then also, so basically just a way of exporting metrics. But on the other hand, which I believe is equally important, we are working on a default set of dashboards. So for everyone to use, which tell you like, hey, these are the things you actually should monitor in those environments. And then also comes with alerting recommendations. So basically, hey, if this goes wrong in your cluster, this is something you should actually start to worry before things go totally sour and you run into like data loss or something like that. So basically giving you a recommended insights into your cluster by deploying default, probably a Grafana dashboards, but if you use something else for monitoring, you can also translate them to other systems. So basically this is going to be our encoded approach about like monitoring recommendations. And next slide. Arango search improvements. So there are actually a number of improvements, as we see actually more and more people picking that up, both in the community and also on customer side. The probably big feature, which might not make it into the first 3.60 release, but definitely the cornerstones are already there, is kind of fuzzy search, which opens that up for like a large number of use cases. Then we have late document materialization for views. So we're also going to see that in more detail on one of the next slides. We have better support for array comparisons and array tokens. And then we also enhance the Ngram analyzer with, for example, UTF-8 support and autocomplete features, or kind of like leading towards autocomplete features. So fuzzy search. You can already do things in that direction, but with fuzzy search, queries like this are going to be super performant, and you can leverage basically something if you have something similar, like for example names. My name is Jörg, which everyone spells in a different way. And pronunciation, I just was at a coffee store here in the morning in San Francisco. There's so many different ways to pronounce that and actually enter that also in the search engine. So this is going to be super helpful to actually search based on some similarity or fuzziness across large documents. The second feature is this performance improvement we've been talking about. So if previously I would issue that query, the limit with the limit phrase here, we would actually just generate all of that, which can lead to slow query performance. But now this is actually much more performant as we're first materializing the result / intermediate result once it's actually needed. So I think this is pretty cool for the Arango search roadmap. And I won't go into more details for the other features, but feel free to ask questions regarding those. Then we have a number of performance optimizations. The first one, I think I already mentioned that in the TLDR, is the subquery optimization. So if you have subqueries as shown here on the left, where you use like named substatements, then we now basically can view that holistically. Similar as with parallel AQL, this is probably going to come in multiple steps. So the first subquery optimization in 3.60 is going to support already queries like that. So it's kind of supporting this 80% of use cases. And then for the remaining 20, we're actually adding more and more in 3.61 and 3.62. This is the current plan, just to kind of enhance that further. Similarly with the second big performance improvement, which is parallel AQL. If you actually have dived or kind of worked with performance improvements, trying to optimize your queries, you might have seen that certain statements are trying to fetch stuff from different servers in parallel. So here, this is an output of the explain statement in ArangoDB. And for example, the gather node here, it's going to gather all the intermediate results from the different nodes in sequentially. So basically, it's going to wait for the first result and then so on and so on and so on. So with this improvement, we can actually query different servers in parallel. And this is going to lead to already quite big performance improvements, especially in distributed environments. Over time, we're also going to work on more improvements here. But I think this is already kind of this 80–90% of queries which can benefit from this particular improvement. The last kind of block of features is the hot backup improvements. So as mentioned, we now, or you might have noticed that in the first iteration in 3.5.1, we didn't support Errango search views, which now will be supported. Furthermore, there is a force flag. So this force flag basically lets you force to take a consistent snapshot despite you might have long-running transactions in your cluster. Let me just explain that a bit. So what the hot backup feature is doing, as we want to be able to take a consistent snapshot across like a large cluster of nodes, it needs like a brief second where it synchronizes all servers, so there are actually no running write transactions. Read transactions don't really matter as they don't modify the state, but we need to have like one consistent point in time where we know, hey, we can actually take the snapshot here across all those servers. And this might be challenging if you actually have a large number of long-running transactions, because there might simply be no point in time where there's no long-running transactions. And now there's actually a force flag. This is deliberately something you should enforce to enforce transactions being stopped. We are a bit, so I'm a bit hesitant with that, because it makes like debugging and looking at your logs a bit harder, because you might see like aborted transactions. But on the other hand, it actually allows you to make sure you get consistent snapshots despite a lot of long-running transactions in your cluster. And furthermore, we're improving the experience around incremental backups. So what you can already do with hot backup as of today is take like a lot of snapshots at any point in time, because it's really quick. It's basically just a copy, on-demand copy of the RocksDB state, the underlying state of the database. So it doesn't have to copy anything directly, because it's just like a virtual filing. But with the further improvements, we're going to make sure that it's also easy for you to upload and manage, so basically distinguish between like a full backup and an incremental backup, so you don't have to diff tools yourself. So this is probably quite a big usability improvement if you care about incremental backups. Those were kind of the big themes we had around 3.6. As mentioned, I wanted to keep this a bit more informal. So feel free to suggest what other things you're missing, or what you actually would wish for 3.7 for the 3.7 webinar. And there are a number of other small and larger, especially performance improvements, as mentioned, for scalability, and also other usability improvements. So we always strive to actually make it easier for you guys to use ArrangoDB. So feel free to also complain or suggest, give constructive feedback about what you would actually need. I'll switch over to the chat, so feel free to actually suggest anything you would still be interested in. Also, if you want a more deep dive on any of those features or about ArrangoDB itself, feel free to just mention that in this in the Slack here. Yes, you could in search views actually complete on each character or word. Yes. So sorry, I should repeat the question first. Probably not everyone sees the chat. My bad. So the question was, in search views, the autocomplete will be on each character or word. Yes, you can configure it to basically get that experience. Would it be interesting if we had a dedicated Arango search webinar on those features, or also how to leverage that? Okay, thanks. And there are actually even Q&As. So there's a question for Greek in Arango search for stemming NLP. You could actually, that's probably a question for the webinar. Did you try with the configurable analyzers, which might already makes it easier? Oh, the question, otherwise feel free to ping me on Slack, then I can just connect you to Andre directly, and I'm pretty sure you can figure that out together. The question here is, when is it out? So as mentioned, the goal is for end of this year, and currently all I checked in with the engineering team, it looks pretty good. So I'm like 90%. You should always be careful with that because probably it's going to haunt you one day. By end of year or before end of year, so you definitely have something to play with across the Christmas break. You said, so as far as I know, you can't automatically set data on an import, for example. Oh, so I think it would be interesting to be able to trigger an AQL query on data manipulation. Yes, so I think this question here goes in the general direction of triggers, which we are actively discussing. So my personal feeling is that having triggers, so I think it's kind of like interesting to think about the semantics of what it would mean to have a trigger, because you kind of there's this, if you worked with distributed systems before, it's really hard to get this one-off semantics correct in a distributed setup. So what I could imagine, and feel free, so that would actually be something I would be curious about, so please ping me on Slack about that. Whether it would make sense if we had like an events collection for you to look at. So basically, you can monitor, have some Fox-like thingy running, or whether trigger would also be sufficient if you had an at least once or an at most once semantic. So just curious about what would be the exact semantics around those triggers you're thinking here. I'll stop sharing for a second because I can't see the Q&A here. Oh yeah, here in Q&A there's another question, which is, do you see any 3.6 improvements that might assist your ML work? Definitely. First of all, the scale for queries and query performance is super helpful. And also having the one chart feature, because if we do have those graph queries where we construct features from graphs, it's super helpful if we know those can actually be executed on a single node. So definitely I see some improvements there. And I also find that all the improvements we have around Arango search, especially like fuzzy matching, are super helpful also for constructing features from like full text. And also play into this ML pipeline here. The other question here in this chat is also community 3.5 will be the same time as enterprise. Yes. So we, at least as of right now, but also there are no plans to do so. We don't distinguish between them. I mean, community is super important for us. So we would always try to keep those release dates in sync. Any other questions? So someone forgot his question, but feel free to just ping me on Slack. Maybe one last question from my side is, oh, my name on Slack is just Jörg, J-O-E-R-G, so that should be pretty easy to find on Slack. Like one advantage of my name is that at least it's easy to find, despite all the different spellings. Last thing is, as mentioned, like this is the experiment to kind of have an more interaction with the community, to share kind of the plans, to get early feedback on plans. So we were kind of thinking about something like office hours or community sessions, which this could be a part of. So if that's something you're interested in, feel free to just either mention that here or also ping me on Slack. So more than happy to actually get that going. As mentioned, we're trying to actually get it to a even better, I think it's the right term, community experience here. Cool. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. And as mentioned, just ping me on the RangoDB community Slack if you have any follow-up questions. We'll share the recording and slides. I'll also post the slides in the community channel, so feel free to dive into them. And otherwise, feel free to also provide feedback. The other thing, this is probably not going to happen for 3.6, but actually this is other really good important point is we probably are going to share more of the roadmap also utilizing Jira. So this is currently the discussion. Let's just see about that you can actually, if you, that you can get like an insight into the progress also, despite those updates here. Cool. Thank you so much, and hopefully see you soon. Bye.